On the seventh night, I read Lena's book out loud on the porch. I heard breathing below the rail that did not belong to me or my dog. It stayed through 3 pages, steady and close, while the cedar smoke flattened in the cold air and the canyon went dark. I did not see what listened, but I knew I was no longer reading to an empty ridge. What followed changed the shape of my life, without changing where I lived. I was 61 that fall, and I had moved back to the old cabin above the Smith River Canyon 2 months after Lena died in our kitchen in Portland. The stroke took her in one morning before the kettle boiled. There was no long illness, no warning, no slow goodbye. There was a bowl in the sink with apricot peels in it and her glasses folded beside the newspaper, and then there was a silence in every room that did not match the furniture. I did not leave the city because I hated it. I left because every corner of it held her outline, and every outline had a hard edge. The cabin had been my grandfather's place first, then my father's in the years he still trapped and cut selective timber by hand. I had rebuilt the porch 10 years earlier, replaced 2 roof sections, and told myself Lena and I would retire there. We made plans the way people do when they think there is time. After she was gone, I packed the truck, loaded Scout, and drove south in rain. Scout was old by then, blue heeler coat gone pale around his muzzle, one ear bent from a cattle kick he took when he was young and foolish. He still moved with purpose in short bursts. He still checked the perimeter of any place we stopped. At the cabin, he went room to room while I stood in the doorway with a cardboard box of Lena's books and felt my hands go weak around the handle. No one greeted me up there. That was the point. The nearest neighbour sat 5 miles downriver, a retired mechanic who came up for elk season and kept mostly to himself. Town was 22 minutes away if the road held. I made that drive once a week for fuel, flour, lamp oil, and mail. People knew me by name from the school district and from years teaching Klamath classes at the community centre. They nodded. They asked practical things. How was the road? Was the spring still running clear? Did I need chains yet? Nobody asked me to explain my face. My days settled into work because work was measurable and grief was not. I split fir rounds before first light while frost still held the grass stiff at the edges. I checked the spring box and cleared pine needles from the intake screen. I walked the fence line with pliers and a roll of wire to patch where limbs had come down. At noon, I graded packets for the remote tutoring job I kept after retirement, mostly middle school language assignments sent in through a weak satellite link. I corrected spelling, marked verb endings, wrote careful notes in the margins that sounded steadier than I felt. Inside the cabin, I left traces of Lena in place without discussing it with myself. 2 bowls on the table in the morning, even when I only filled 1. 2 cups on the draining rack. Her chair angled toward the window, not pushed in. A stack of her dog-eared hardbacks by the porch door, each with penciled marks in the margins where she argued with characters under her breath. I told Town I was managing fine. At home I moved through rooms, as if I might startle her if I turned too quickly. She had one ritual I had never thought much about until she was gone. Every evening, unless weather made it reckless, she sat on the porch with a blanket over her knees and listened while I read aloud. She kept her eyes closed most nights. Not asleep, just listening. Sometimes she asked me to go back and read 1 paragraph again, the way a person replays a songline they do not want to lose. I used to tease her for making novels into church service. She used to smile and say, "Read slower." I did not read at all those first weeks alone. I ate in silence. I banked the stove. I went to bed early and woke tired. Then one evening in late September, I carried one of her marked library hardbacks to the porch without planning to. The cover was warped from years of use, and one corner had a strip of brown tape where she had mended it. I lit the old hurricane lantern, set it by the rail, and sat in the same chair I always used when I read to her. Scout settled near my boots with a huff and laid his chin on his paws. The words came rough at first. My throat tightened at simple lines, names of towns, weather reports in the story, a woman stirring soup. I paused more than I read. The canyon below held that broad evening hush that comes after wind drops. I kept going anyway. When I reached the chapter break, I looked over to Lena's empty chair and nodded once, out of habit, as if she had asked me to continue. I read again the next night, and the night after that. Same hour, same chair, same lantern glow. Scout learned the rhythm and stopped shifting once I found the pace. By the first week of October, the routine held me up the way fence wire holds shape even when a post has gone soft. I finished one book and started another from her stack. I read into cedar dusk while ravens crossed overhead and the first cold pressed low over the river. On the seventh night, the air had a clean bite and my breath showed in pale threads when I paused between pages. I was halfway through a chapter when Scout raised his head and listened toward the dark under the porch. He did not bark, he did not stand. His ears turned, then settled again. I waited for the usual sounds of raccoon feet or a fox nosing at old leaves. But what came was a slow inhale, then an exhale, close enough that the air below the rail clouded faintly in front of the lantern light. I sat still and counted 3 breaths. Mine was one pattern. Scout's was another, lighter and faster. The third stayed low and even, not strained, not hurried, as if whoever or whatever it belonged to had chosen a place and taken a seat. I did not reach for the rifle by the door. I did not call out. I read the next sentence and heard the breathing remain through it, then through the next page. When I stopped, it stopped. I set the book face down on my knee and listened. The canyon gave back only distant water and one loose board tapping under the eave. Scout lifted his head, watched the dark below the rail, then lowered it again. That small motion settled something in me. He had guarded this place through storms, coyotes, and one black bear that wanted the chicken feed years earlier. If he was not showing teeth, I took that seriously. I went inside, latched the door, and stood at the sink with both palms on the counter until my hands stopped trembling. Not from panic, from recognition. It felt like being addressed in a language I had almost forgotten, but still knew in my bones. I slept badly, woke before dawn, and checked the soft dirt around the porch with a flashlight, while frost still clung to the steps. There were no clear tracks there, only disturbed leaf litter, and one pressed arc near a post too broad for Scout's paw and too smooth for boot tread. I did not drive to town that morning, though it was my supply day. I split wood, hauled water, graded papers, and kept looking up toward the timber edge beyond the clearing. Around noon, I found myself speaking out loud while stacking kindling. "Easy now," I said, though nobody was there but the dog. Scout looked up, tail giving one short beat against the floorboards, then went back to sleep in a patch of sun by the door. That evening I set the porch as before, lantern cleaned and filled, book opened to the folded page, Lena's chair where it had always been. I added one thing without thinking too hard about it, an apple from the crate by the sink, placed on the far end of the rail where any porch visitor could reach it without coming near me. I sat down, cleared my throat, and began reading the first line of the chapter in a voice that sounded steadier than it had the night before. Halfway through, the breathing returned below the rail. Same distance, same patience. Scout kept still, ears forward, no growl in him at all. I read until the lantern wick burned low, then closed the book and said into the dark, quiet and plain, "That is enough for tonight." No answer came that I could name. The breathing eased away. A board near the steps gave one soft creak, then another, then nothing. I waited 10 full minutes before standing. The apple was gone. I slept a little deeper after that, not because I understood what had come to the porch, but because the silence in the house no longer felt vacant. It felt occupied by listening. That was a different kind of solitude, and I could carry it. The next night, I read again. Same time, same place. Scout at my boots, lantern on the rail, Lena's marked pages under my hand. The ridge darkened. The river kept its line through stone below us. And just beyond the reach of light, something listened as if the words mattered. I stayed on the porch a while longer after that last line, book open in my lap, eyes on the dark where the rail ended and the yard fell away toward timber. The lantern flame had gone thin and blue at the base. Scout slept against my boot, warm and heavy, with one paw twitching in a dream. Nothing moved in sight, but I felt watched in a quiet way that did not scrape my nerves raw. When I finally stood, my knees popped loud in the stillness. I took Lena's book inside with both hands, the way I used to carry it for her when she nodded off in the chair. I set it on the table, brushed ash from the stove lip, and checked the door latch twice before bed out of habit, not fear. Scout made one slow circle on his blanket and sighed into sleep. I lay awake longer than he did, listening to the roof settle and the spring line tick against the siding. The breathing from below the porch had stopped before I came in, but I could still hear the shape of it in memory, steady as someone counting time. At first light, I put water on for coffee, then stepped outside with the axe while the grass still held frost in white edges. Fir rounds split clean in the cold. The sound carried down canyon and came back thinner. Each piece I stacked had a place, bark side out, rose straight under the lean-to where winter rain could not soak it through. That work had always steadied me. I knew the swing weight, the shoulder pull, the angle where the grain opened without fighting. When Lena was alive, she sat on the porch rail and called out when I rushed it. Now there was no voice to slow me, so I counted each split under my breath in Klamath, old numbers my grandfather used when he taught me to set fish baskets. After wood came water. I walked to the spring box with a rake and cleared fir needles from the intake grate, then checked the pipe run for leaks, where roots lifted the line each year. The spring still ran cold and clean, iron taste at first swallow, then sweet. I filled 2 buckets and carried them in on the shoulder yoke my father made from ash. By late morning, I sat at the table with my tutoring packets spread in 2 stacks, one for revision, one for grading complete. Satellite lag made the messages come in bursts. Kids from 2 counties sent voice clips and worksheet photos through school laptops that froze when weather thickened. I listened, marked their endings, and wrote notes in the margins in a hand I kept neat on purpose. Good vowel length. Check your suffix, I wrote to one boy who never used punctuation. Read this line out loud again, I wrote to a girl who rushed every verb until the sentence cracked. I did not know most of their faces anymore. I knew their mistakes and their effort. That had to be enough. The cabin held itself around me with old sounds. Tin roof ticking, stove door settling, one loose window latch that clicked when wind shifted from the north. Lena's chair stayed by the porch door, cushion gone flat where her left hip used to rest. I kept meaning to restuff it and never did. Some tasks I avoided because fixing them felt like agreeing she was not coming back. At noon, I heated beans in a cast iron pan and cut the last heel of fry bread from the previous day. Scout took his portion outside and ate in 3 slow bites, then stood at the timber edge with his head angled downslope, listening to something I could not hear. He did not bark. He just watched, then turned back when I called. That afternoon I walked the fence line on the south side where 2 posts had leaned after the last windstorm. I tamped fresh gravel at the base, tightened wire with pliers, and tied new staples in by hand where the old ones had worked loose. Elk crossed there most evenings. If the line sagged too far, they took it as permission. By the 2nd week of October, my days had fallen into a narrow track that held from dawn to dark. Chop, carry, mend, grade, cook, sweep, read. The rhythm gave me places to put my hands when my mind drifted toward the kitchen in Portland and that half-peeled apricot in the sink. I returned to the porch before dusk with a lantern, the same book, and a clean wool blanket over my knees. The apple I had set out the night before was gone, as I already knew. Not cored, not chewed, simply absent. I set another on the rail without ceremony and began where I had left off. Scout lay near my boots, but he did not sleep as heavily. Twice he lifted his head and looked under the porch boards. The breathing came after a few pages, low and measured. I read through it. When I stopped, it stopped. When I closed the cover and said, "Good night," the dark gave one soft board creak and then released. That pattern held 3 evenings straight. Same chair, same hour, same quiet listener below the rail. The 4th morning, I found broad impressions near the woodpile where I had raked the dirt smooth 2 days earlier. They were not boot tracks, no heel edge, no lug pattern, no sharp toe line. They looked pressed by weight through something wide and flexible. I crouched beside the closest one until my knees went numb. The shape ran longer than my hand and wider than my palm spread full. There were no claw tips at the front the way bear sign usually shows in soft ground. I set my tape from toolbox to mark length, then wrote the number on the back of an old feed receipt and tucked it in my shirt pocket. By noon, wind had picked up and dried the surface hard. By evening, loose duff had blown over half the marks. I did not cast them in plaster. I did not photograph them. I stood there and looked until Scout nudged my calf. Then I went inside and put the receipt in the drawer with spare batteries and twine. That night, I set out half a loaf of fresh fry bread instead of an apple. I had no reason for the change except that apples were nearly gone and I could make bread. The next morning, the loaf was missing from the enamel plate. In its place sat a smooth river stone, dark grey, oval, clean as if rinsed. Not from my yard, not from this slope. I rolled it in my hand while coffee boiled. It fit my palm with a worn dip on one side where water had shaped it over years. I set it on the windowsill above the sink and told myself floods throw strange debris uphill in heavy weather, though there had been no rain. 2 days later, I left smoked salmon trimmings on the stump by the steps before reading. At dawn, the fish was gone, and a narrow strip of cedar bark lay in a loose braid where the plate had been. The braid was not tight like cordage from a machine. It was hand-twisted, uneven in one section, then corrected and finished clean. I knew cedar work. My grandmother taught me how to split inner bark and soften it with steam. This braid had that same patient pull and turn. I held it to my face and smelled wet wood and river damp. Scout sniffed it once, sneezed, and went to lie by the door. Town day came with low clouds and thin rain. I drove in for lamp oil and feed, parked by the hardware store, and stood in line behind 2 men arguing about culvert permits. When it was my turn, the clerk asked if the upper road had washed out yet. I told him no and paid cash. I did not mention tracks, missing food, or braided bark. On the way back, I stopped at the library drop box and exchanged Lena's finished novel for another hardback, with dog-eared corners and somebody's penciled notes in the margins. I did not choose by title. I chose by weight and paper smell, and how it sat in my hand. That evening, rain started just before dusk and tapped the roof in a fine, steady pattern. I read from the new book under a canvas flap I had rigged to keep the lantern dry. Scout stayed close, tail tucked around his paws against the damp. The breathing did not come from below the rail that night, but I heard 2 slow knocks from farther out in the timber, spaced wide apart, then silence. It was not branch fall, not woodpecker rhythm either. Too low, too deliberate. I listened until my neck stiffened, then read on, because stopping felt wrong. The next morning, I found no new tracks by the woodpile, but 3 raven feathers lay parallel on the porch step, quills aligned toward the door. Their barbs were dry despite the night rain. I looked up at the roofline for signs of a kill or nest scatter, and saw none. Ravens crossed this canyon every day, but they did not usually place feathers like tools laid out for work. I swept the step clean, then stopped midway and put the broom aside. I carried the feathers in and laid them beside the river stone and the cedar braid on the sill. Scout watched me do it, ears half raised, then rested his chin on my boot as if that settled the matter. The night after, wind dropped and the cold came down early from the ridge. I lit the lantern, opened the book, and read until my voice warmed. Halfway through the chapter, Scout gave a low growl toward the timber edge, not the sharp alarm he used for coyotes. A warning sound held deep in his chest, brief and controlled. I laid one hand on his shoulder. He quieted, but he did not take his eyes off the dark. I did not look hard enough to force an answer from shadows. I kept my place and read the next page, then the next. A listening weight stayed beyond the circle of light, close enough that I felt it rather than saw it. When I finished, I set a plate with bread crust and salmon skin on the stump and stepped back to the chair. "Same time tomorrow," I said softly, words meant for the dark and for myself. Nothing answered in language. The trees stood still. The river moved below like it always had. Yet the porch no longer felt like the edge of my property. It felt like a meeting place I had entered without knowing the rules, learning them one evening at a time. I stayed in the chair until the lantern glass cooled enough to haze, then carried it inside and set it by the stove. Scout followed, nails ticking on the plank floor, and paused at the door with his nose lifted towards the yard. He did not bristle. He did not whine. He only listened, then came to his blanket and laid down with a long breath. I stood at the window above the sink with the room dark behind me and watched the timber edge until my own reflection covered it. Rain moved in after midnight, light and steady. It drummed on the tin roof and found the old gutter seam near the east corner, a sound like fingers tapping a cup. I slept in short pieces and woke before dawn to feed the stove. When grey light came, I checked the stump by the porch steps. The plate was clean. In the centre sat another stone, flatter than the first, with a white quartz line running through it like a river on a map. I turned it in my hand and looked down slope. The grass bent under rain. Alder leaves shone black-green. No shape stood at the tree line, but the quiet held attention in it. I put the stone on the sill beside the first one, the cedar braid, and the 3 raven feathers. Then I went out to split wood because wet weather never waited for a man to sort his thoughts. The day stayed narrow and practical. I hauled in 2 armloads of fir, scrubbed the porch boards with a stiff brush, and reset the canvas flap where wind had torn one grommet loose. Scout shadowed me through each task, stopping often to watch the same section of brush where vine maple crowded the first line of cedar. Each time he looked there, he held still, ears forward, then came back when I moved. By late afternoon, the rain thinned to mist. Clouds sat low in the canyon and turned the river into a pale strip without edges. I lit the lantern early and took Lena's hardback to the porch. The pages smelled of old paper and wood smoke. I ran my thumb over one of her penciled notes in the margin, a small underline and 2 words she had written years ago. Read this slow. I read as the light left. Scout lay near my left boot, but he did not settle fully. He kept one ear turned toward the slope. Halfway through the chapter he stood, not stiff, just alert, and stepped to the end of the porch where he could see past the railing. His chest made a low sound, more breath than growl. I followed his line of sight. At first I saw only rain mist and trunks. Then a shape separated from the trunks without moving. It stood half behind a vine maple at the timber edge, where the ground dipped before the ravine trail. Tall enough that its shoulder line rode above the lower branches, broad through the chest. Dark hair matted in long, wet strips along its arms and side. The head was angled slightly toward me, as if listening from better than 30 yards out. My hand closed around the book until the cover bent. I could feel my pulse in my throat and in the fingers that held the page. Fear came first in the body, a hard pull across my back that told me to step inside and bar the door. Wonder came with it, just as strong, because the shape was real in the same way the porch rail was real. Not rumor, not a misread stump, a living being watching in open view. I did not stand. I did not call out. I kept my voice even and read the next line, then the next. Scout looked from me to the tree line and back again. He did not bark. That steadied me more than anything. The figure stayed through half a page, almost still. A drip line ran from its forearm to the leaves below. When Scout shifted his weight and took one step forward, the figure drew back with 2 smooth steps into the cedar shadow. No charge, no rush. One moment present, the next, folded into trunks and rain. I sat without reading for a full minute, eyes fixed where it had been. The mist moved. Nothing returned. Easy, Scout, I said. He came back to my boots and leaned against my shin, warm and solid. I laid my palm on the top of his head and felt the damp in his coat. Then I opened the book again and finished the chapter aloud to the dark line of trees. When I closed the cover, I left the rest of the fry bread from supper on the stump and went in slow, keeping my back to the porch light until the door shut. Inside, I checked the rifle in the rack and set it back where it stayed. I did not clean it or load it. I made tea instead and sat at the table with the cup between my hands until steam stopped rising. At first light, I walked to the tree line with Scout at heel. I did not cross into the cedars. I looked where the figure had stood and found bent vine maple shoots and 2 deep impressions in wet duff, longer than my boot, edges softened by rain but clear enough to read as weight. I measured with the tape and wrote the number on another feed receipt. Then I folded that slip and put it in the same drawer as the first. Evidence existed whether I showed it to anyone or not. By the 3rd week of October, rain held for 4 days straight, and the canyon wore one color from dawn to dusk. I kept the porch ritual in weather that would have sent most folks inside. Canvas flap tied down, lantern wick trimmed short against wind, book wrapped in oilcloth until I sat. The listening did not fail on any of those nights, though I did not see the figure again at first. On the 5th evening, I chose my overture with more care than I wanted to admit. I mixed cornmeal and flour for fry bread before noon, let the dough rest near the stove, then fried 3 rounds in cast iron. I smoked a salmon strip over alder coals until the fat turned clear at the edges. At dusk, I set half a loaf and the salmon on the enamel plate and carried it to the stump before I took my chair. "This is for tonight," I said toward the trees, voice low. No answer came except rain ticking on leaves. I returned to the chair, opened the book, and read. The breathing did not come from below the rail that night, but the sense of attention stayed out there, steady as a hand on a fence post. In the morning, the plate was empty. In its place lay a fresh cedar braid, thicker than the first, and tied through with a grass stem to keep it from unraveling. I hung that braid on the nail by the porch door, where Lena used to keep her garden gloves. Scout sniffed it and gave one short wag. The next evening, I repeated the same offering. Bread, salmon, clean plate, stump. I did it before lighting the lantern so any watcher could see the act plain. While I struck the match, Scout gave a soft huff and looked upslope. I followed his gaze and found the figure again, this time farther left, where a dead snag leaned over a patch of fern. It stood in full outline for several breaths. Taller than any man I had known, shoulders heavy, arms long enough that the hands rode low near the thigh. Rain darkened the hair to near black, except where grey-brown showed along the flank. The head stayed angled towards the porch, not lowered in threat, not lifted in challenge, listening. I felt the same split inside me as before, caution and awe pulling at once. My feet wanted the doorway. My chest wanted to remain. I set the lantern down and stepped to the top stair, empty hands visible. Scout stayed close, body quiet, eyes fixed on the tree line. "It is all right," I said, and the words were meant for both of us. The figure did not move for a long count of heartbeats. Then it shifted weight to one leg and eased one step out from behind the snag, not closer by much. Enough to show trust measured in inches. The rain ran off its shoulders in narrow streams. I could see the breadth of its face now, the deep set of the eyes under a heavy brow, the mouth closed and still. I did not go down the stairs. I read from where I stood, voice carrying into wet cedar air. After a paragraph, I returned to the chair and kept reading until darkness thickened between trunks. When I finally lifted my head, the figure was gone. The plate on the stump remained. I left it there overnight. At dawn, the food was gone, and 3 small stones sat in a row where the salmon had been, each one pale and smooth as if sorted by hand. I set them with the others on the sill. Patterns were forming now, simple and deliberate, and I chose to meet them with the same care. 2 nights later came the first time we held ground together in clear view. Wind had dropped. Mist lifted enough to open the canyon wall in layers. I placed the plate on the stump and stayed standing beside it, not retreating to the chair yet. Scout stood at my knee. The figure appeared at the timber edge almost at once, as if it had been there before I stepped out. We watched each other across that short field of wet grass and brush. My hands stayed loose at my sides. Its arms hung long and quiet. No sound came but water below, and one raven crossing high. I took 3 backward steps to the porch, turned and sat. Only then did it move. It came forward to the first line of alder, stopped, and waited while I opened the book. I read until my voice settled into the old cadence Lena loved, steady and unforced. The figure remained in place through the chapter, a dark post at the edge of trees, listening. When I reached the final line for the night, I closed the cover and nodded once into the dusk. "Same time tomorrow," I said. The figure held for one more breath, then turned sideways and disappeared between cedars without breaking branch or brush. Scout circled once and lay down against my boots. I sat with the closed book on my lap and felt the porch become what it had not been since Lena died. Not a place where absence echoed, but a place where presence arrived and stayed long enough to be known. I sat a long minute after Scout settled, listening to the river below and the small sounds of the house behind me. The night had turned damp, and a low wind moved up the canyon in slow pulls. Somewhere past the first line of cedar, a branch knocked once against another and then went quiet. I stood, took the lantern in and barred the door the way I always did. Scout did not come straight to his blanket. He stayed at the threshold with his head low, watching the dark through the crack under the door, then followed me only when I touched his shoulder. Rain started before midnight and stayed until dawn, hard enough at times to blur the window glass. I checked the spring line at first light, then the culvert ditch by the road, then the lower fence where runoff always chewed at the posts. Everything held for that day. The creek in the ravine below the cabin had turned from clear to brown by afternoon, carrying bark strips and foam. Scout refused to drink from it when I took him down to look. I kept the evening reading anyway. The canvas flap snapped over the porch rail, and I had to keep one hand on the page corners so they would not lift in the gusts. No figure showed at the tree line. No breathing came from below the boards. The listening I had come to feel each night was absent, and the porch felt hollow again for the first time in weeks. I read through 2 chapters, set bread and salmon on the stump, and went in with a weight in my chest I could not name. By the 4th night of rain, Blackwater Rise had come up the canyon the way old men in town said it would, fast and mean and without patience for mistakes. The side creek sounded wrong at sundown, deeper than rainwater, and moving with a grind in it from stone and limbs. I lit the lantern early. Scout paced the length of the porch twice, whined once toward the ravine trail, and would not lie down. "I hear it," I told him. I opened the book and tried to keep the line steady. I managed 3 pages. Then 2 heavy knocks sounded from downslope, spaced apart, low enough to carry through the rain and the creek noise. Not branch fall, not axe work, open-handed, deliberate, the way I had heard before in the timber, only closer now, and urgent. Scout gave a short bark and stood rigid at the steps. I set the book face down, took the lantern, and stepped into the rain. The stump plate was untouched. Bread and salmon sat where I had left them, rainwater beading on the fish skin. A shape moved at the edge of the yard, just beyond the alder, broad shoulders dark with water. It did not come toward me. It turned downslope, looked back once, then moved 3 paces and waited. That was the first time it had asked anything plain. I went inside and moved fast without rushing. Oilskin coat, headlamp, logging rope from the mudroom peg, hatchet from behind the stove, leather gloves. I added the short fence jack from the truck bed because the creek banks grew root tangles in flood, and I had needed leverage there before. Scout pressed close to my knee while I gathered gear, then bolted to the door when I lifted the latch. "Stay with me," I said. The rain hit like thrown gravel once we left the porch light. Fresh tracks cut the mud on the path. Long strides, deep toe push where the slope steepened. I kept the lantern low to save the wick and followed the sound of water. The ravine trail had turned slick, clay over stone, and twice I caught myself on alder trunks to stay upright. Scout ranged 10 yards ahead, then circled back each time I slowed. At the bend where the side creek met the river, the bank had partly collapsed. Floodwater shoved through root balls and downed limbs in a brown surge, climbing inch by inch over the gravel bar. In the center of the tangle, half in water, half in mud, a smaller one lay twisted on its side with one leg pinned deep under a woven mass of roots and lodgepole branches. It was breathing hard and shallow. Each pull of current rolled its shoulder and drove it against the snarl. Across the channel, the larger one stood chest deep near a fir, braced against the flow. It struck the trunk twice with an open palm, then looked straight at me. There was no charge in it, no bluff, only a fixed urgency and a stillness that made the choice plain. Leave now and keep what I had left, or go in. I dropped the lantern high on a stump where the light would hold, tied one end of the logging rope around a cedar snag on my bank, and fed the coil out through my hands. The water between us ran fast, but not yet at the peak line on the rocks. I looped the free end around my waist, clipped it back with a steel carabiner, then gave Scout 2 sharp points toward the bank. Back, stay. He crouched, whining, but held position above the slide. I entered at an angle, knees bent, boots feeling for stone that did not roll. Cold hit through the oilskin and climbed my spine. 2 steps in, mud took my left leg to the shin. I leaned on the rope and crawled the last yard to the trapped youngster. Up close I could see it was young, but not small like a child. Maybe the size of a thin teenager, hair plastered flat by rain and silt. Its eyes tracked me wide and bright, then flinched when I touched the pinned thigh. "It is all right," I said, low and steady. "Hold still." The leg was caught beneath a forked root under tension from the current. I chopped 2 feeder roots with the hatchet, short controlled cuts, blade turned away from flesh. The main root did not move. Water shoved another limb into the tangle, and the larger one on the far side caught it, turned his body, and threw it clear before it could strike us. He kept bracing upstream, taking the debris first. I worked the fence jack under the root, footplate sunk in mud, lifting arm against wet wood. 1 click, 2. The root rose a finger width and slipped back. I reset deeper, wedged a rock under the base and cranked again. This time it held. The trapped leg came free in a sudden slide, and the youngster cried out once, a rough sound swallowed by rain. "Now," I said, mostly to myself. I got both arms under its chest and shoulder and dragged it clear of the tangle while the current pulled at its free leg. The larger one moved parallel on the far side, matching us step for step. I clipped the rope from my waist, looped it under the youngster's arms, and threw the running end across a narrow gap where a gravel tongue almost bridged the channel. The larger one caught it in one hand, planted his feet, and leaned back. We pulled in short bursts timed to the surge. I hauled from my side. He hauled from his, and the youngster kicked when it could. Twice the line snagged on submerged branches. Twice I went under to my shoulders, clearing it by touch. On the 3rd pull, we got the youngster onto the gravel tongue. I crossed after, belly low, and together we moved it to high ground above the new watermark. When I finally stood, my legs shook from cold and strain. The youngster's thigh bled from a long tear where root bark had stripped skin, not pumping, but steady enough to matter in that weather. It tried to rise and collapsed. The larger one touched its shoulder once and looked at me again, then upslope toward my cabin trail. I nodded. Cabin. Fire. There was no time for argument with a flood. I cut 2 poles from downed alder with the hatchet, threaded my tarp between them from the truck kit stashed at the trail turn, and made a drag litter rough but serviceable. We rolled the youngster onto it with 3 coordinated lifts. The larger one took the front pole in one hand. I took the rear and most of the balance. Scout ran ahead, then back, then ahead again, checking each turn. We climbed in mud and rain with the creek roaring behind us. Twice we stopped to reset grip on the poles. Once the larger one halted dead still, listening downslope, then urged forward with a quick head motion before another branch fall, cracked in the ravine. By the time we reached the porch, my gloves were slick and my shoulders burned. I got the door open, shoved the table aside, and dragged the old horse blanket in front of the stove. The youngster came inside only after the larger one stepped to the threshold and held there, watching. Scout stood stiff near the stove, tail low, then sniffed once and backed to my side without growling. I took that as permission enough to continue. The larger one did not cross the sill. He settled under the eave in rain shadow where he could see through the open door. I set a kettle on full flame and stripped my wet coat while water heated. Then I worked by habit. Shears through matted hair around the wound. Clean rinse with boiled water cooled to warm. Mud and bark flecks came free in brown streams. The tear along the outer thigh was deep but clean-edged, with no bone exposure and no obvious break when I tested gentle range at the knee. I packed yarrow salve from my field tin along the torn skin and wrapped it in torn flannel strips, tight enough to hold, loose enough for swelling. The youngster trembled through every touch and tried to pull away once. I kept one forearm across the hip and murmured the same line I used on calves and dogs, and myself in hard weather. Easy, easy now. Hours passed in stove heat and rain noise. I fed it spoonfuls of warm broth with salt and rendered fat, waiting between each swallow so it did not choke. It took the spoon awkwardly at first, then with a tired focus that looked almost human in the lantern light. When shivering hit, I added 2 more blankets and tucked hot stones wrapped in cloth along the uninjured side. Scout lay 3 feet away, chin on paws, eyes open, calm. Near midnight, the rain eased from a roar to a steady fall. The larger one had not moved from the porch edge except to shift weight now and then. Once I stepped outside with a basin of bloody rinse water, and he gave one low chest sound. Not threat, more like acknowledgement. I set the basin down, emptied it away from the steps, and returned inside. By the time the stove clock marked 2, the youngster's breathing had slowed. Skin at the muzzle felt warmer. Pulse at the wrist, faint but regular, no longer racing. I changed the bandage once more when seepage showed through and found the bleeding reduced to a slow line. Good enough for the night. I sat back on the floor with my shoulders against Lena's chair and closed my eyes for a minute that became 10. When I opened them, Scout was asleep. The youngster was awake, watching me. Not wild, not tame, simply alert and present in the same room, both of us too tired to pretend the world was simpler than it was. I reached for the nearest book on the table without planning which one. It was Lena's marked hardback, still damp at the corners from where I had dropped it on the porch. I opened to the bent page and read in a low voice so the sound would carry through the cabin and out under the eave. The youngster's eyes eased half shut by the second page. Outside, the larger one stayed in place, a dark shape beyond the threshold, listening until the kettle sighed and the first thin grey of morning began to touch the window. The first grey line of morning spread across the window glass while I read, and the room took shape again around us. The youngster lay on the horse blanket with one arm across its chest, breathing slow now, eyes open but soft. Outside the threshold, the larger one stood under the eave, rain running off his shoulders in thin streams. Scout slept with his nose on his paws, close enough to touch my boot. I finished the page and let the book rest open in my lap. The kettle gave a low hiss on the stove. Wet wool and yarrow and smoke mixed in the room. The youngster watched my face, then the book, then my face again, as if sorting what each thing meant. I moved my hand, slow and plain, and set the book on the floorboards where it could see I was empty-handed. "It is morning," I said. The youngster blinked once. Its eyes were deep brown in the weak light, clear around the edges now that fever had eased. Not wild, not tame. Awake in a way I had no word for. It lifted its head, winced, and let it down again. I slid closer on one knee and touched the wrapped thigh to check heat through the flannel. Warmer than my hand, but not burning. Swelling held, not worse. I loosened one knot and looked at the wound line. Clean. No fresh mud. Only thin seepage where movement had pulled at the edge. I retied the wrap and sat back. At the door, the larger one shifted and gave a short breath through his nose. Not a warning. A question. I nodded toward the youngster. Better. He held my gaze, then looked to Scout, then back to me. Scout lifted his head, met those eyes for a beat, and laid his chin down again. That settled more than any sign I could have asked for. I dipped broth from the pot into a tin cup and waited for it to cool. The youngster pushed itself up on one elbow this time and stayed there, shaking but steady enough. I offered the cup. It did not take it at first. Its nose moved over the steam. Then one long hand came up, brushed the rim and pulled back. I kept my arm still. On the second try, it wrapped both hands around the cup and drank in short pulls. Slow, I said. It paused when I said it, then drank slower. Light widened across the floor. Rain eased to a soft drip from the roof edge. I rose and opened the door all the way, then stepped aside. The larger one remained where he was, half in shadow, watching every motion in the room. He did not cross the sill. He did not need to. The doorway held all three of us in one line, and no one broke it. The youngster set the cup down and gathered itself. I moved in as it tried to stand, one arm ready under its shoulder. It leaned against me with surprising weight and a tremor that ran through its back. We got it to its feet for 2 breaths, then 3. Its injured leg touched down and shook. It made a low sound in its chest, then forced a little more weight through the wrapped thigh. Enough, I said. Sit. It looked at me as if weighing whether the word mattered. Then it lowered itself back to the blanket, controlled and careful. The larger one gave another low chest sound from outside, softer this time. I picked up Lena's book from the floor and held it against my chest. The youngster's eyes followed it. I opened to the bent page and read 3 lines, no more. It listened without moving. At the doorway, the larger one turned his head toward my voice and stayed that way. When I stopped, silence sat in the room like another body. The youngster reached out. Not for me, not for food, but for the edge of the blanket where my hand rested. Its fingers touched the wool, then the back of my wrist, light as a leaf landing. It kept that touch for 1 breath, then withdrew. That was the moment I understood what had passed between us. No claim, no debt counted, only recognition, clear and plain, between living things that had carried weight together in cold water and come out breathing. I placed my hand flat on the floorboards, palm down where it could see, the same way I used to settle frightened horses. The youngster looked at my hand, then set its own hand down beside it, not touching now, just near, matching the shape. Long fingers, scar at one knuckle, mud still caught in the hair at the wrist. Outside, the larger one lowered his head once. It was small, almost nothing, but deliberate. By full morning, the rain had stopped. Mist moved through the cedars in low bands. I changed the bandage one more time with boiled water and clean flannel from the shelf. The youngster watched each step and held still when I pressed the salve in. When I tied the final knot, it made no sound at all. 3 hours after sunrise, it stood again. This time it held. I moved with it to the doorway, one hand under its arm, then let go. The larger one stepped back from the threshold to give space. The youngster tested the leg on the dry plank once, twice, then took a short step onto the porch. Scout stood, sniffed the air, and stayed at my left knee. The yard was wet and bright under clearing sky. Water still roared in the ravine, but lower than in the dark hours. At the timber edge, two shapes stood where there had been none at dawn. Both tall, both still, both watching from the first line of cedar. They had come without sound. I felt my breath catch and then settle. The larger one turned his head toward them and gave a low call that carried only a little way, more vibration than voice. The two at the trees did not move closer. They waited. The youngster looked back into the cabin once, eyes moving across the stove, the table pushed aside, Lena's chair, the blanket on the floor. Then it looked at me. I do not know what it saw in my face. I know what I saw in its alertness, fatigue, and a steady attention that did not flinch. "It is all right," I said. "Go." It took 3 careful steps down the porch stairs. The larger one moved beside it without touching. At the yard's edge, the youngster paused and turned back again. We held each other's gaze across the wet grass for a long count, long enough that the river and birds and roof drip all seemed to fall behind it. Then it lifted one hand to chest height, palm angled toward me, and lowered it. I answered with the same motion. They crossed into the cedars. The 2 waiting figures folded in behind them, and all 4 were gone, between one breath and the next. I stayed on the porch until the chill reached my bones. Scout sat against my leg, leaning just enough to remind me where I was. On the top stair, where the youngster had paused, lay a strip of cedar bark, braided tight and tied with a single hair-thin root. I picked it up and held it in my fist all the way inside. I cleaned in silence because there was work to do. I scrubbed the floorboards where mud had dried. I boiled the shears and set them in sun on the sill. I burned the bloodied rinse cloths in the barrel behind the shed and buried the ash under gravel by the south fence. The broken root fibers caught in my rope I combed out with a knife tip and rehung the line to dry under the eave. By late afternoon, the cabin looked like itself again except for the moved table and one damp blanket by the stove. I took the feed receipts with track measurements from the drawer and set them beside the river stones, feathers, and braids on the windowsill. Then I added a new note in pencil. Flood night, ravine bend, juvenile freed, wound wrapped, departed walking. I folded that paper and placed it under the stone with the quartz line. Evidence existed. I did not need anyone else to sign it. 3 days passed before the road crew reopened the lower switchback after washout. I drove to town for lamp oil and salt and a new spool of fence wire. At the counter, the clerk asked if Blackwater had touched my place. "Creek climbed high," I said. "Cabin held." He nodded and wrote my total on the pad. No one asked more. I offered no more. When I got home near dusk, a fresh cedar braid hung from my fence post at shoulder height, dry despite the afternoon mist. No tracks held in the wet grass long enough to read. I touched the braid, then went in and lit the lantern. That evening I set half a loaf of fry bread and smoked salmon on the stump as before. Scout took his place at my boots. I opened Lena's book to the next page and read into the cedar dusk. I did not look up each minute. I kept the cadence steady, line by line. Halfway through the chapter, Scout's ears turned toward the timber edge and relaxed. I raised my eyes. A tall shape stood just inside the last band of trees, still as a post, head angled to listen. Not close, not hidden, present. I finished the chapter and closed the cover with both hands. "Good night," I said. The shape remained for one breath, then slipped back among the trunks. By the second week of November, the visits had settled into rhythm. Same time, same place, unless weather drove hard enough to bend the fir tops. On those nights, I read from the doorway and left the food under the eave. In the morning, the plate was clean and some small tokens sat in its place. A smooth stone, a feather laid straight, once a crossed pair of alder twigs, as neat as any mark on paper. When first frost came, I moved Lena's chair 1 foot closer to mine and left it there. I stopped setting 2 bowls at breakfast. I still paused at the sink some mornings with my hands on the counter, still felt that old ache move through me like cold through floorboards, but it no longer emptied the room. The house had sound in it again, even in silence. Winter pushed in. Then spring returned with high water and soft banks. Black water came up the canyon once more, loud and brown, and went down without taking the cabin. On the first clear evening after the surge, I found 3 cedar braids hanging from the south fence, evenly spaced, each tied at the same height. I read that night, with a lantern on the rail and Scout asleep at my boots. Mist rose from the river. Stars opened one by one above the ridge. At the tree line, one tall figure stood in the dark gap between 2 cedars and listened until I spoke the final line, then turned and let the night fold around him. I stayed on the porch after he disappeared, book closed in my lap, lantern glass warm against my knuckles. Scout slept hard with his ribs rising slow, and frost began to silver the top rail. The river had dropped enough that I could hear separate notes in it again, not one loud brown roar but current over stone, and then the deeper pull in the middle channel. I listened for footsteps, branch snap, breath under the boards. None came. The quiet had settled back into its older shape, but it did not feel empty now. Inside, I laid Lena's hardback on the table and stood at the sink with both hands on the wood edge. Same place I had stood on that first night. The windows showed only my reflection and the lantern behind me. I turned and looked at the sill where the collected things sat in a row. First stone dark and oval. Second stone with the white quartz line. 3 pale stones sorted by size. 4 cedar braids, one thicker than the others. 3 raven feathers still aligned from when I first carried them in. 2 feed receipts with track lengths written in pencil. The folded note from flood night under the quartz stone. I did not sleep much. When light came, I made coffee, fed Scout, and pulled the old school ledger from the shelf, where I kept tax records and elk tags. At the table, I copied each date I could verify from memory and weather notes, then added details I had measured or touched with my own hands. Track lengths, placement of feathers, the crossed alder branches on the stump, the 2 open palm knocks on rain nights, the breathing below the porch rail that stopped when I stopped reading. I sketched the ravine bend where the youngster had been pinned and marked the cedar snag where I anchored the rope. I wrapped the 2 receipts and flood note in wax paper so damp would not erase them. I tied the packet with twine and set it in Lena's old metal recipe box, the blue one with chipped enamel on the lid. The stones stayed on the sill. The feathers I slid into a clean glass jar so mice would not pull at them for nesting. The braids I hung from pegs by the porch door, each with a small paper tag from my grading stack. Date, weather, placement found. I had no plan to show any of it. I did not want to lose it either. By the 3rd day after that clear night, the tutoring packets had piled up on the satellite queue. I graded through the morning while rain hissed low on the roof. Around noon, the district coordinator sent a short message asking if flood damage had interrupted my schedule. I typed back, "Creek rose, cabin held, work on time." She answered one line, "Glad you are safe." That was the full exchange. No one called, no one asked for more. In late afternoon, I drove to town for lamp oil, dog feed, and library returns. The road still showed wash scars where Blackwater had crossed, and a county truck sat by the lower culvert, with 2 men measuring silt depth. At the hardware counter, the same clerk totaled my items and looked at the mud on my boots. "Upper Canyon still rough?" he said. "Passable now," I said. He nodded and pushed my receipt across. "Road crew says 1 more storm this week." I heard. He started to say something else, then stopped and looked toward the window where rain had begun again. If he had a second thought, he kept it. I took the bag, thanked him, and left. He never raised the topic again on later trips. At the library drop box, I handed back 2 books with Lena's pencil marks in them and checked out one more hardback from the used shelf for $1. The volunteer at the desk stamped the card and smiled at Scout waiting in the truck. "Still reading out loud up there?" she asked. "Every evening," I said. "Good habit," she said, and that was all. The rain came hard that night, slanting from the west, and I read from the doorway with the lantern hooked under the eave. I set bread and salmon under cover on the stump where water could not soak it through. Scout stood beside me through the chapter, coat beaded with fine spray. No figure showed in the tree line. No knocks sounded from the ravine. When I finished and brought the plate in, the food remained untouched. I slept without worry. At dawn, the rain broke and left a clean cold. The plate was empty then. On the porch step sat a single alder twig laid across another in a neat X, same pattern as the first crossed branches I had found weeks earlier. I carried them inside and set them on the ledger page, then drew the shape in pencil and wrote, "Repeated sign. Deliberate placement. Same orientation as first pair." I did not claim meaning beyond what I could observe, but I did not dismiss it. 2 evenings later, sky clear and moon thin over the ridge, I lit the lantern and heard one low knock from far down slope as I opened the book. Not close, not urgent, only a signal that arrived before the first sentence and did not repeat. Scout lifted his head, listened, and settled. Halfway through the chapter, the tall shape took its place at the timber edge, same distance it had held on other calm nights. I read without pause. At the final line, I closed the cover, and the figure withdrew. On the stump afterward, I found a new braid tied with 2 grass stems instead of 1. By the second week of December, frost stayed in the grass until noon, and the porch boards held a thin skin of ice at dawn. I moved slower in the mornings, knees stiff, hands taking longer to warm around the cup. The routine held me through it. Wood before light, springboks check, 1 fence walk if weather allowed, packet grading at noon, reading at dusk. Scout's hearing had dulled enough that I touched his shoulder before giving commands, but he still turned toward the trees a few breaths before I ever saw movement. On the day that marked 1 full year since Lena died, I drove nowhere and answered no messages. I split half a cord, stacked it straight, and cleaned the stovepipe. At dusk, I brought her chair back to the exact angle she used, not 1 foot off as I had left it, and laid her old wool blanket across the back. I put one of her penciled books on that seat and took another for myself. When I stepped outside, the air was still and cold enough that my breath rose in clear white lines. I placed no food that night until after the first page. Then I stood, carried bread and salmon to the stump, and returned to the chair. The figure appeared at the tree line before I sat down. Scout lay across both my boots, fully asleep, trusting the space in front of us. I read Lena's marked passages slower than usual, including the underlined paragraph she had once made me repeat twice in the same evening. My voice caught once and settled again. When I finished, I did not say good night right away. I looked towards the trees and raised my hand to chest height, palm angled out. The figure did the same after a moment, then lowered its hand and turned back into cedar shadow. I waited until it was gone, then set an extra piece of fry bread on the stump and went in. Winter passed in distinct nights, each one ordinary in task and not ordinary in meaning. I did not tell town stories. I did not send photographs because I had taken none. I kept the ledger current. Each new object found at the porch went to one of 3 places: stones on the sill, braids on pegs, feathers in glass. If weather damaged a braid, I noted it and burned it in the stove with cedar kindling. Nothing was discarded without record. Nothing was offered for proof. When spring runoff began again, I walked to the ravine bend on a clear morning and stood where the flood line had reached my thigh the year before. The bank had changed. New gravel bar on the inside turn. One older uprooted and lodged higher than it should have been. I found the cedar snag with old rope marks still faint in the bark. I set my palm there for a few breaths, then turned back uphill. That place needed no marker beyond itself. On my next town day, the district coordinator called while I loaded feed sacks. I stepped outside the store to hear over the truck noise. "You still want the same tutoring hours next term?" she asked. "Yes," I said. "Same load, same days." "Good. Students ask for you by name." I looked up at the ridgeline above town where cloud was lifting in strips. "Tell them to read slow," I said. She laughed once, soft and brief. "I will." I drove home before dusk, unloaded feed, and lit the lantern as the first evening birds crossed the yard. Scout curled against the porch post and slept before I opened the book. The house behind me was unchanged in its boards, roof, and old repairs. The canyon was unchanged in its weather, water, and distance from town. I was still one man in one cabin with no close neighbors and no witness waiting for a report. But when I read, I no longer read into absence. I read into a shared quiet that had answered, asked, and remembered. On clear nights now, the final image held steady enough to feel like truth. Lantern on the porch rail. Lena's open book in my hands, Scout asleep across my boots, and one tall figure standing just inside the last band of trees, still as a fence post, listening until I spoke the last line and the dark took him gently back.